About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, fantastic farms where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills, and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, lets out a ghastly creak and comes to rest, and immediately ash-gray men with leaden spades swarm up and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot about them and moved away. But the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, dulled a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour. There is always a pause here of at least a moment, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he strolled into popular cafes with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. I had no desire to meet, though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her. But I did. I was taking the train with Tom up to New York one afternoon, and we stopped by the ash heaps. He leapt to his feet and, taking me by the elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I suspect he'd tanked up a good deal at lunch, and in his determination to have my company bordered on violence, the supercilious assumption was that on a Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence, and and back along the road 100 yards or so under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight were a small block of yellow brick on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes, and the third was a garage. Repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The only car in sight was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford that crouched dimly in a corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope leapt into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old boy," said Tom, slapping him on the shoulder jovially. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week," said Tom. "I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" No, he doesn't," insisted Tom coldly. "If you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all." "I didn't mean it like that." said Wilson. His voice trailed off. Tom glanced around the garage impatiently. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in her middle 30s, faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously as some women can. There was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if every nerve in her body were continually smoldering. She wet her lips and, moving through her husband as if he were a ghost, approached Tom and shook his hand, looking him flush in the eye. She spoke to her husband in a low, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down?" "Oh, sure," said Wilson, and went off towards the office door, mingling immediately with the color of the concrete walls. And a gray dust veiled everything. Veiled his hair, and his suit and his hair, as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except for his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you," he said. "Get on the next train." She nodded and moved away just as her husband returned with 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was near the 4th of July, and we watched a scrawny gray Italian child setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad track. "Awful place, terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful," I said. "It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband mind? Wilson? He's so dumb he doesn't know he thinks she goes to visit her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." And so Tom, his girl, and I went on the train to New York. Or actually, Miss Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those East Eggers that might have been on the train. She changed her dress into a brown figured muslin which clung tightly to her wide hips as Tom helped her down from the train in New York. At the station drugstore, at the newsstand, she bought a copy of Town Tattle and a couple of Broadway scandal sheets. At the drugstore, some cold cream and a flask of perfume. We moved from the mass of the station into the echoing drive. She let 4 taxi cabs drive away before selecting a new one, gray with a lavender interior, and in this we moved out into the sunshine. Immediately she tapped on the glass. Immediately she turned away from the window, sharply, and tapped on the glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said. "They're nice to have. I want to get one of those dogs," she said, "for the apartment." We backed up to an old gray man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller, and slung from his neck was a basket of very recent puppies. "What kind are they?" asked Miss Wilson enthusiastically as he approached the taxi window. All kinds. What kind do you want, lady? I'd like to get one of those police dogs, she said excitedly. I don't suppose you have that kind. He glanced searchingly into the basket, plunged in a hand and pulled out a brown, and pulled out a pup by the back of its neck. That's no police dog, said Tom. Oh, it's not exactly a police dog, said the man doubtfully. It's more of an Airedale. I think it's cute, said Miss Wilson extemporaneously. Look at that coat, said the man, running a hand over the wash rag of its back. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold. The Airedale. Evidently, there was some Airedale mixed up in it somewhere, though his paws were startlingly white. Changed hands. How much is it? Asked Miss Wilson. That dog? $10, said the man. The Airedale changed hands and sank down into Miss Wilson's lap. Here's your money, said Tom. Go and buy 10 more dogs, was it? We moved back along the park toward 158th Street. Went back towards some specific avenue. It was warm and pastoral. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep walk by. I've got to leave you here, I said. No, you don't, insisted Tom. Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you leave, won't you, Myrtle? I'll call up my sister, she said. I'll telephone my sister, said Miss Wilson. She's said to be quite beautiful by people who want to know. So we pulled up to one slice in a long cake of apartment houses, and collecting our purchases and throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson led us inside. An elevator boy was dispatched to fetch tin and a box of hay, and added on his own volition a box of dog biscuits, one of which sat apathetically decomposing in the saucer all afternoon. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson telephoned up several people. Oh, I'm going to call them the Keys, she said from the flat below. Sitting on Tom's lap, she telephoned up several people, including his sister Catherine. The apartment was too small. The furniture was too large. The tapestries of Versailles, women swinging in the gardens of Versailles, and one photograph, an overly enlarged picture, what appeared to be a hen sitting on a rock, but from further away revealed itself to be the countenance of a woman, a bonnet and the countenance of a woman. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened has a hazy cast over it. A dim, hazy cast over it. Even though, until 8 o'clock, the apartment was full of cheery sun. Ms. Wilson, sitting on Tom's lap, telephoned up several people, including Sister Catherine, and there were no cigarettes, so I went to get some from the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, Tom and Miss Wilson had disappeared, so I sat down and read a few chapters of Simon Called Peter. Either the whiskey had affected things, or it was terrible stuff, because it made no sense to me. When Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink, we called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced arriving at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and drawn on again at a more rakish angle. But the efforts of nature at the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. Innumerable pottery bracelets jangled. When she moved, innumerable pottery bracelets jangled up and down her arms. She looked at the furniture with such ownership that I asked her if she lived there. She laughed out loud immodestly, repeated the question, and then said that she lived in a hotel with a girlfriend. In an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, and there was a spot of white lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greetings to everyone in the room. He said he was in the artistic game, and I deduced later that he was a photographer, and he had taken the over-enlarged picture of Mrs. Wilson's mother that beamed down into the room. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume again. And with the change in dress also came a change in personality. Gone was the impressive vitality we'd seen in the garage, and replaced by a gaudy hauteur. As she expanded, the room got smaller until she was pivoting, so she was rotating on a pivot through the smoky air. I tell you, she said to her sister in a high, mincing shout, "These fellas will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. Why, I had a woman up here to look at my feet the other day, and when she gave me the bill, you'd think she had my appendicitis out." "What was the name of the woman?" Mrs. McKee asked. "Miss Eberhardt. She goes around looking at people's feet in their own home." "I like that dress on you," said Miss McKee. "Oh, this old thing?" Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment with a raised eyebrow. "This is a crazy old thing I put on when I don't care what I look like." And then Mr. McKee wants to take her photograph. And that's all I got.